But I want to talk now about a fighter on the come up.
Okay.
And he's no longer a prospect. He's no longer a hype train, as Kevin Holland corrected me in our podcast the other day. Paddy Pimblett is a good fighter.
Yeah.
The guy brings something that's an X factor.
Yeah.
When his music hits the speakers, especially in Manchester, you feel it.
Yeah.
You feel the vibe. You feel the big fight energy. And last night we saw the skills.
Yeah.
We felt that X factor for a while, but we haven't really seen the skills.
Right.
Bobby Green is no slouch on the feet. You know, we've seen Bobby Green get in there and mix it up with some of the best strikers that the UFC has at 155
Right.
and do quite well with it. Paddy looked very composed on his feet last night, and he did what a lot of really good veterans do. He capitalized on a mistake of his opponent.
Yeah.
Bobby shot, which I have no idea why he did that.
Yeah.
But it took Paddy's noticing what was going on, quickly locking up that guillotine, realizing that the foot was there to clear the leg, immediately cleared that leg, locked up the triangle, and that was all she wrote. And if the triangle wasn't enough, he did have an armbar that would have snapped Bobby's arm had he implemented it.
Almost looked like he did when Bobby was asleep, sort of.
Yeah. Bobby was out cold, so very impressed with Paddy Pimblett.
Yeah.
He called out Renato Moicano.
Love that.
You know, Show Me the Money podcast, Matty Betts, those guys.
Shout out to the boys.
Shout out to you guys. Yeah, we love those guys. You know, that was a great call out.
Yeah.
And I hope that Moicano gets that fight because it's big for both of them. Moicano does have a fight lined up with Benoit Saint-Denis. And this is why a Paddy the Baddy versus Moicano fight does make sense. Because Paddy's going to enter the top 15 now.
Right.
And I think the fight makes sense whether he loses to BSD or wins. Because if he loses, then Moicano and him will be similar in the rankings.
Right.
They're both personalities. They're both big names in the sport. People like both of them. People want to see both of them fight. But if Renato Moicano can pull the upset and get past BSD, which is a tall task, but I think it's possible, then Moicano is top 5 material.
Right.
And now you have Paddy the Baddy coming in to fight a top 5 guy.
Right.
If he can beat him, then you're talking about a guy who's a title contender. So the fight against Moicano makes sense. The BSD fight's around the corner. If I'm Paddy's team, I wait to see what happens with that fight, and then I try to get in there with Moicano towards Christmas or maybe the beginning of 2025. I love that fight. Want to get your thoughts on that fight, but first, what did you think of Paddy's performance in rising to the occasion?
Yeah, I love the fight, love the call out, and that will be an entertaining matchup. But when you're talking about Bobby Green versus Paddy, it felt to me, and I was going back and forth on my predictions. Unfortunately, I settled in on Bobby Green just because I thought for sure Bobby was going to keep the fight standing. And Paddy being, even though he's a great grappler, he's very decorated in jiu-jitsu and knows what he's doing on the ground, when he's fighting in front of his home country's crowd, and look, we've seen him in the UFC now for 6 or 7 fights. He doesn't go out there and do his jiu-jitsu. And if you were like us, we were paying attention to Paddy the Baddy before he made it to the UFC. And Paddy was a submission ace.
Yeah.
He was submitting everybody. And at some point, I was like, all right, I like Paddy. I'm along for the ride on the Paddy the Baddy journey. I want to see how far this guy can go. I was a little bit like everybody else, like, he might still be a hype train. It's still to be determined. His fights are a little bit mismatched, but at the same time, he hasn't been in here all that long. So let's bring him up the right way. It's not his fault that he got signed to Barstool at a young age and very early in his career, and he started making money that way and really started making a lot of noise worldwide. You can't say that a guy that just because he's really popular and seems to have good skills deserves to be in there with the top 5 in the world. You have to bring him in the right way, and I think 6 or so fights is great before he gets his ranking. And now people are going to see the number on next to his name and the fact that his name is one of the biggest draws in the lightweight division, which is saying something because the lightweight division has
some big names. Yeah.
Right. That's the prettiest girl in the entire roster, right?
Yeah.
The lightweight division is the most sought after, most difficult division, and it's got the most stars in it. But Paddy the Baddy is sort of shining through in his own way and competing with the guys at the top of the division. So I really did like what I saw out of Paddy, and I want to see more of the jiu-jitsu style that we saw out of him. And I love that you said he didn't force it because that's not what he did at all. He didn't go out there trying to look for a takedown. Bobby Green didn't like the striking that Paddy was able to land on him. And that's why you had a striker like Bobby who loves to keep it on the feet, immediately looking for a shot in the first round. And when you talk about the guillotine, a lot of people tell you, MMA coaches, and they're not wrong for this, never jump the guillotine. Unless you know for sure you've got it. And even if you feel like you've got it 99%, don't jump it because it's too risky. You can wind up in a bad position. MMA fighters are really good scramblers, and it's just too much of a nightmare to deal with. Don't worry about it. But Paddy clearly has a really dangerous guillotine, and once he felt that he had his hands around Bobby Green's neck. He knew it was all over. He jumped the guillotine, immediately started to throw his legs around to keep Bobby inside of his guard. It was a thing of beauty. I was really impressed by Paddy the Baddy. He goes out there in front of his home crowd, and just like we were saying earlier in this video, some people see it as a home crowd advantage, and some people see it as a home crowd disadvantage. And I always wonder with a fighter, like Manchester crowd, they seem great, and UK fighters notoriously do well when they're fighting on home soil. But you never know what's going to happen until the guy actually walks out there. But I think after last night, it's safe to say Paddy the Baddy has arrived. People see him now not just as a big name, but as a big talent and a big threat in the division. And there's going to be more people wanting to get those fights because they see not only the big name, but they see the rank next to him. I think Moicano is the perfect next step up in Paddy's career. I don't think that's an easy fight. I think Moicano might come in as a slight favorite, actually.
Yeah.
And for me, that one's an interesting fight stylistically just because Moicano is very good on the ground. Moicano is very good everywhere. And while I'm not discrediting Bobby Green or any of his skills, because I know he's a great fighter, and to be in the UFC and fight the caliber of fighters that he's had and still be on the roster means he's a very good, well-rounded fighter. But I think stylistically, Moicano brings more to the table for Paddy to have to deal with. I think, if you take Moicano to the ground, it's not so easy just to get him out of there. And when you talk about striking with Moicano, he's sort of a wild card. You never know what you're going to get. He'll throw some crazy stuff at you, and Paddy does the same thing, which leads me to believe that the fight will be fireworks when it does happen. I feel like it's all but signed. We'll see BSD and Moicano do their thing, and I think they'll just keep Paddy chilling until about the end of the year. They'll put him on a big card, maybe an MSG, or a big card out in Vegas right at the end of the year. They'll really try to push him in front of the American audience. And then by 2025 starts, I think we're going to see Paddy make a legit run down the rankings. Now, how he does in those fights is totally up to how well he prepares and how good of a fighter he becomes. But at the same time, when you're moving like that and you've got all this, momentum behind you, and now you're able to engulf people in this moment of fight. I'm fighting Paddy the Baddy. This is like a crazy moment for me. If he's able to freeze his opponents a little bit like that and go out there and continue to just rip through people, I think the future is very bright for him. And I know he's in a hard weight class, but I feel like in about 3 fights, we could see him in there with some very meaningful names and some very high-level fighters, also possibly in the top 5. So a lot to be said for Paddy the Baddy. I'm really happy to see his success. And look, the people out there love him. The people over here seem to love him. Everybody's got their wig on. And Paddy the Baddy, look, he's the real deal. The hype train is real.
Yeah, I think it's safe to say he's a legitimate top 15 contender at this point. And I'll leave you with one alternative to Moicano. Let's say, for example, he does go in there and suffers a brutal knockout to somebody like BSD.
Right.
That could potentially, delay things. You mentioned jumping the guillotine.
Yeah.
There is one guy that wants one more fight.
Oh, man.
Dustin the Diamond Poirier versus Paddy Pimblett. That fight, to me, would be a big, big marquee fight.
Very
Probably co-main event on a pay-per-view card. Dustin Poirier is the legend of the generation that's just coming to an end. What better way? And a lot of people don't like Paddy.
Right.
And a lot of people that don't like Paddy are also the same people that love Dustin.
Right.
So that fight makes a lot of sense from a marketing and entertainment perspective.
Right.
A lot of people want to see somebody beat Paddy, and they would love for that somebody to be somebody like Dustin the Diamond Poirier.
True.
Paddy fans want to see him get wins over the marquee fighters. Bobby Green was the first step in that direction. Tony Ferguson, we all know where Tony's career has gone the last few years. Dustin Poirier just fought for a title.
Right.
He looked pretty dang good doing it, by the way. It was against Islam Makhachev, but certainly not a performance to scoff at. I think that if Moicano doesn't work out, and we do know that Dustin wants one more. Yes, there's Nate Diaz out there, but who knows if he's ever going to come back to the UFC. Do we really want to see Conor in there with Dustin again? Do we really want to see Justin Gaethje in there with Dustin again?
Yeah.
Maybe Colby Covington, but my appetite for that's not huge. I don't hate the idea of Dustin Poirier versus Paddy Pimblett.
Yeah, I mean, it's a fall off as far as rankings go for Dustin Poirier, but at the same time, Dustin's already been to the top of the mountain. He kind of understands that his title shot days are over. And at this point, it's all about doing something fun, getting out of your comfort zone. And what better way to do that than to fight the next generation of fighters? And I think Paddy the Baddy, whether you love him or hate him, his skills are becoming undeniable. His record in the UFC is undeniable. And if he keeps going in this direction, I think he winds up in a fight on the tail of the tape with somebody like a Dustin Poirier sooner than a lot of people even realize.